Hello and welcome to another episode of A View from the Top. I'm Adrian Cropley. A View from the Top is a regular podcast from the Centre for Strategic Communication Excellence, where I interview some of the world's leading communication professionals as we explore their career journey. Today I'm in person and in the same room with media trainer, advisor and spokesperson, plus one of our top crisis communication management consultants, Luke Waters, in our hometown of Melbourne. Let me tell you a little bit about Luke. Luke Waters is the founding director of Saltwater Media Solutions and has a background as a senior journalist and media trainer. Luke's journalistic career has exposed him to some of the world's most complex, diverse and volatile events, and we'll get into that into the interview. Other titles that we can include in Luke's career is journalist, presenter, producer, chief of staff at a range of media organisations across Australia. He's a member of the CNN International Journalism Fellowship and has reported extensively around Australia, including from the Canberra Press Gallery. He's also been embedded within Australia and international militaries, reporting from the Pacific, Southeast Asia and the Middle East and the United States and Africa. So he's been right around the world, working with militaries and reporting. So I'm sure there's lots of stories to talk about. Luke, welcome.
Adrian, good morning and thanks very much for having me.
It's great to have you on this one. It's great to actually be in person for once. I know we were dying to get together and go, we're going to do this in person rather than all over the Zoom and record it all.
It's very refreshing. It's been too long as life on Zoom.
It has, so it's nice to be back. You know, I'm going to kick in because I think there's a lot of learnings in people's careers by what it is that you're doing now. Because I think, you know, as you go through your career, you build up to what you're currently doing. So tell me a little bit about Saltwater and what is it that you do now? And I believe there's a technology spin to this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So Saltwater Media Solutions is primarily a media training organisation based in Melbourne, but we do train people across Australia and also some international clients as well. Essentially, it's looking at either individuals or groups, either small or large, and making sure they actually have an understanding of how they can communicate effectively through the media. So obviously there are common errors, people thinking that it's a measure of their intelligence or their subject matter knowledge and that sort of thing, but it's not. It's about kind of the boring stuff like the preparation, having messages in order, having them well rehearsed. And so we have plans and processes and what have you, and theory training, and then obviously practical training as well, where we help organisations do that. The other side, I guess, is also, as you referenced, the crisis communications, where again a simple plan but an effective plan for organisations for that horrible event which may or may not take place, but we need to be prepared for.
Yeah, and being prepared for crisis, it's it's just a key thing and a skill. Have you found over the years those skills have changed the way that you train people in it? Has it evolved because of things like social media over the years? And how has the landscape changed?
Yeah, certainly social media, it changes things. I still think to a certain extent though an effective message is an effective message. And when you get back to that preparation process, sitting there and saying, what's the objective of my communication? Why am I actually doing that? Getting absolute clarity around that is perhaps the most important first step, and trying to make sure people don't underinvest in that, because once you've got the clarity around why am I as a spokesperson or we as an organisation actually trying to communicate here, it's really then that those messages can be modified for the format, be it social or conventional media. Absolutely, that is the case. But I do think that certainly technology plays a role, and I think can play a role more going forward in terms of the way organisations manage and communicate effectively.
Yeah, brilliant. And I just want to tap onto that software element, because I know you and I had a bit of a conversation before we kicked off the interview today that you're developing a software.
Yeah, so when it comes to technology, I guess an observation I've made through a range of sectors with whom I work, so whether it is all the tiers of government, corporate, emergency management, higher education, NFP, NGO, all people, I guess, that have exposure to surges of media inquiries from time to time, there's always a little bit of a lack of organisation when the rubber hits the road and the phone starts ringing. Where are the key messages? Who are we going to use as our spokesperson? All those sorts of things, and also perhaps to organise it perhaps for your proactive media engagements as well. So over the past 18 months or so, myself, technology not being my absolute strength, along with a couple of software developers, have been looking at a platform. So it's Comtrove, and it essentially looks to streamline that whole process from the time an inquiry comes through to an organisation. Again, a single repository for all the relevant information around spokespeople, around media details, around key messages, around decisions and actions that an organisation has taken around a particular event or situation. Again, either proactive, reactive, or crisis, and that's essentially what it does. But I think one of the benefits of it at the end, I'm finding, perhaps for the ultimate decision maker in this communication environment, whichever organisation, is reports and analytics, to actually be able to sit there and say, well, how many inquiries did we get? How did we manage them? Where do we need to improve? Because it seems to be such a skill, or such a sector, or such a thing, communications, where we reckon we did okay. Yeah. The sentiment was positive or neutral. Let's move on. We're actually having a look at how this can be measured and getting a bit more of an idea of how we've really gone.
And that's really important, is to capture those analytics and those measures in that. And if you've got a software that can do that, as well as streamlining the process, making it more efficient, it's really interesting. I think you get to a stage, and I'm not going to date either of us, but you get to a stage in your career where you've learned so much that you go, so how do we improve on this one, and what can I do to kind of contribute? So I'm really pleased that you're in that phase of developing this one. Is it released, or is it coming?
Yeah, so we've got a couple of foundation clients, and we're going to be starting to market more broadly in the next month or so, month to 6 weeks. So I'm not sure exactly when this podcast will be released, but it's going to be around that June of 2022.
Oh, I'm going to get people to keep an eye out for that one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, hopefully we'll be doing some marketing, and it will become evident to people.
Okay, keep an eye out, everyone. Let's see what's coming along. Anything that can help us in our jobs, in our work as communication professionals, I think is just absolutely critical. So I'm going to take a few steps back, only a few. And we'll start with your early career. Did you wake up one day and say, I think I'd like to go into journalism, I'd like to be in media? What drove you into it, and what studies did you do?
Yeah, so interesting question. I guess I grew up in a house where my parents encouraged us to be informed, and so they weren't really concerned which news or what news we were watching, but just to have a basic understanding of what was going on in the world. And then I guess the way, again, without dating, the way secondary studies and tertiary studies worked at the time was pretty much your tertiary entry was purely on what your score was at the end of your HSC. Right. So very ambitiously, I applied for journalism at RMIT, but was miles away with my academic achievement in year 12, where perhaps I did other things rather than studying.
I think you and me both, Luke.
It's easy enough there's a few distractions at that age. So, you kind of wander off and do a few different bits and pieces, and then, after a couple of years, realised, hang on, that actually is what I want to do. And so studied by correspondence at the time, and my first job was in Taree on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. Oh, wow. It was certainly a fantastic experience being up there for 18 months or so, and then various parts of Australia, so central Queensland, the Riverina, then Adelaide and Sydney for periods of time, and back to Melbourne.
Oh, fantastic. And so that foundation of doing that study and then getting into those early jobs, what did you learn in those early jobs that then kind of spearheaded you towards the next steps in your career? What was it that kind of you went, now I've started doing this is the thing that really motivates me, this is the direction I want to go in?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I suppose from the first couple of years of journalism, really, I was white knuckling my way through, just making sure that I got the story right and didn't misrepresent what people were saying, and didn't get in strife with my boss because I hadn't missed the angle of the story and all that sort of thing. But I think after a period of time, you can take a bit of a deep breath and have a bit more of a broader look at the way people are communicating in the media, the way the media is, using better spokespeople, why they use certain people and that sort of thing. Because it takes a while to kind of have that view of the world, I guess. And so I think that perhaps working in regional television, as it was for me, a little bit in radio and a little bit in newspapers as well, but you're churning out 3 stories a day. Yeah. It's really, really sausage factory stuff, but what you are doing is you're exposing yourself to the process, number one, consistently, and number two, to a lot of different spokespeople from a lot of different walks of life, not all of whom expect to be on TV or speaking in the media, but because of this appetite and hunger for content, they are thrust into this position where they are communicating, and so it's then that you start to observe who does it well, who doesn't do it well, what are these key things that make an effective spokesperson. And it's not always the smartest person in the room, and it's not always the person with the most subject matter knowledge that's able to communicate effectively. So it's a little bit of a I suppose a pattern to how it works.
Is it often the personality or the just the vibe of someone that just comes across as credible?
Helps, and people ask that in media training sessions a lot of the time. Should I be more upbeat? Should I be a little more charismatic? It's kind of not a button you can turn on and off, but as with many things, I think with effective media communicators, getting that clarity around your messages at the start of the process, it's then that inevitably that charisma or that personality or those things will come out because you're quite comfortable with what you're saying. Whereas if you race into it and haven't given it much consideration, that's when you perhaps are a little robotic, which we'll fear when we do interviews.
It gets down to that planning ahead, doesn't it? It's exactly what you do now with people. So it would be hard to have an interview with you without asking you some of the, I'm going to call them war stories, mainly because of the direct military relationship. What got you into news journalism, and particularly going out and being kind of a correspondent in militaries and conflicts? Yeah,
so I guess being in Victoria and being exposed at first, I guess, to natural disasters and bushfires and things like that, I found it an interesting thing to be able to report and actually get accurate stories from environments like that. And we were asked, and I think I was at Channel 10 the first time I did it, to participate in hostile environment training, which is where you go and live in for a week or so, and quite often the facilitators of those courses are people that escort former soldiers and military and what have you, and they escort media through different hostile environments in the world, whether it's protests, natural disasters, and as you referenced, their war zones as well. And so that got me a little bit interested. But then I again, you mentioned before that I participated in a journalism fellowship at CNN in America, and as part of that, you lived in there for every day you're in there for 4 weeks, and you were looking at the different aspects of CNN and the way they treat news. And it was in late 2012, I think, and it was at the time when the Syrian conflict was starting to really get serious. So people kind of thought, it's just kind of part of the Arab Spring and it's gone in its own direction or whatever, but people started to realise, I think, at that point that it was turning into something quite a bit more, and so that was the thing that I sort of focused on, developed an interest in that, and I suppose my interest in that developed, and then to get to Syria was something that I was interested in doing to apply my craft as a journalist. So
that must have been a little terrifying working in that environment, but I believe you captured the interview, right, that no other Australian journalist has been able to get. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the first trip I did to Syria was simply covering from the front line and looking at the impact of the internally and externally displaced Syrians and all the aspects of the conflict, the crisis, whatever you'd like to call it. And I'd applied a couple of times to interview Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian president, and then basically was sitting at home one night and got a call saying that my application had been accepted, and that I think I had 8 days or something to be in Syria to interview him. So I sort of had to ask them to send an email to see if it was true or not.
True, yeah.
I didn't want to.
Was this a scam?
Yeah, that's right. It was, and thinking that I'd mentioned it to my news editor at the time, and he'd sort of politely and in quite an amusing way sort of said, "Yeah, I wouldn't be hanging my hat on that one, mate. It's not going to happen." So that was quite a nice moment to go and tell him that it had been accepted.
So it turned into be a real interview.
It was real, yeah.
How was that experience?
Yeah, really interesting. I guess the process of how an interview like that is managed was something that I hadn't been exposed to before, having been, I guess, an on-the-road reporter, just turning around the story of the day and that sort of thing. So yeah, the process of being briefed by the Syrian government and them trying to impose various restrictions on us, and us sort of saying, well, this is what we feel is appropriate, and eventually getting to what effectively is some common ground, and going and being able to participate in the interview. Yeah.
So I take it in those situations, and this is something you use obviously in your training as well now with the richness of experiences that you had. Is it fairly much sorted before you go in and do these interviews, the territory you can talk about and the no-go places? And
so the way that one worked, they said, what are your 5 topics that you're intending to ask the president about? And I know at the time there were people who criticised the fact that we accepted that. I was at SBS at the time, and people within the newsroom have, not to me directly, but expressed to others that they thought that was not appropriate, that we should do that. But I was lucky to be working with a very senior editorial manager at the time, and he said, well, one of those topics is going to be the crisis, which effectively you can apply any question to. And I'm not suggesting for a second, because it wasn't a hard-hitting interview, that wasn't the objective of it. It was to go and speak to different groups in Australia that had been impacted by the Syrian crisis, and ask the questions that they really wanted us to ask, and that was the genesis for those questions. So while some people may have criticised it, that's for them. Again, they don't do it to my face, but anyway,
that's often the way, isn't it? Everybody has an opinion on something, and look, it's great to have those opinions, but I think there's a fundamental role for communication professionals, whether you work in journalism or any other discipline of communication, is that you have to take these opportunities to educate and get people to learn from the interviews that you do. We hear of today, and this is going into a really weird territory of, with the war in Ukraine, is the stuff that you should and should not be talking about. And I think everything needs to be talked about to understand every angle of this thing.
No, it's true. And, when they say truth's the first casualty of war, I suppose when you go to that place and others, having experienced also from the Palestinian side in Gaza and then also in Israel and other areas as well, you do see that it's a machine, and information is really, really important, and it is a tool of war, and it is used effectively in all those conflicts. And while I haven't followed the Ukraine environment as closely as I have others, I'm sure it's going on both sides there as well.
Have no doubt. No doubt. And it's, reflecting on your role as a journalist in those areas, you look at some of the casualties of war when journalists are killed in action of doing their job. It's one of those very sad events that happen. Were you ever in a situation where you really felt for your life?
No, I don't. I mean, the fact that you're in the Middle East, you're in a war zone, you're wearing a flak jacket, you've got a helmet on, and you can hear mortars falling. To me, that is, I'm concerned, because your safety and security is very much in the hands of those that you're with. And one of the things that I was told really clearly before I went, again from someone whose opinion I respect, is that just because you're with a particular group of people doesn't mean that there's not value in you're not returning, because ultimately they can say, well, look what they've done, look what the opposition's done, and there are examples of that taking place consistently in the Middle East. So you're always concerned around what's taking place. You're always as they call it, hypervigilant,
Yeah.
but looking for particular signs in situations, environments and people. And again, it comes back to some of the training that you do and also a bit of common sense as well. But in terms of someone holding, a firearm and looking down the barrel, I think, no, that didn't happen.
That's great. If I think about it, when you've had that rich experience, I can understand now why you do what you do and why you want to train people and put back into a profession that you've got so much out of over the time. Thinking about all the jobs that you've done, is there one that stands out where you learnt the most in your career?
As a journalist or as in media training?
Any,
I think, look, probably, again, without harking on too much, the Syrian experience from the very first point to the last, because it also involved working as a journalist at SBS and looking at how Islamic extremism impacted on Australia. One of the things I did when I interviewed Assad was you're taken into a room with him and you have 10 minutes with him just by yourself, no producers, none of his staff. I think the theory is for us to develop some sort of rapport. And he said to me, I think Australia is eastern in location and western in culture. And I said, I think it's pretty accurate.
Yeah.
And then he said, but for that reason, I don't think you understand what terror is. I don't think you understand what's happened to our country. And I said, well, with respect, I've been to your country before. I've been to Lebanon. I've been to the surrounding countries that have been impacted by it. And I thought it was really important to tell him as well that, look, in Australia, we also are impacted by young men coming to places like this, doing lone wolf attacks, and that's the sort of stuff that I was covering quite a lot as a journalist at SBS, and looking at the impact that had on the Somali community in particular, who were terrific, had wonderful leaders and terrific people, but for whatever reason they were impacted by this and lost a couple of young men and women, as I understand, to Islamic extremism. So I think, looking at this event, which at the time was actually quite big, if you think back, 8 or whatever years it was, that whole ISIS and the threat of terror and that sort of thing was quite massive. So looking at that from Australia and its implications here, and obviously its hotbeds overseas, was the most interesting, certainly.
And there's so much that you do learn from those great opportunities through your career. What's some of the, as we start wrapping up our interview, what's some of the tips you would give to professionals that are up and coming, those that are studying or new in their career, of really about getting ahead in their career? What should they be doing?
Well, it sounds a little contradictory, and I had a heads up that this question was coming, but I think it is really important to listen to people, listen to others, listen to others that have got your interests at heart, and observe others that have gone on a trajectory that you are interested in going on. But also don't take every piece of information as well, because I think there are different times in my journalism career, I know, where a news editor or a boss or a chief of staff would say, mate, I think you should be doing this. And I'd sit down and have a heart-to-heart conversation thinking that they were actually looking after me, whereas when I reflect, they were looking at a potential hole they had in their newsroom that they wanted plugged. And that's a really low-level example, but I do think it's important to have clarity around what you want, but not put it in concrete, because I know when I started in journalism, I didn't want to end up in the Middle East covering conflict zones or hostile environments, but it was very fulfilling ending up and doing that. So I think it's important to have goals, but also have flexibility in those goals would be the best advice I reckon I could give along those lines.
Great. Well, that's some brilliant tips to end on. And Luke, thank you so much for spending time with me today on A View from the Top. It's been great. I mean, I could go on for hours listening to your stories. I'm sure you've got a ton to share. But thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to hearing about how that software goes when you get that launched the next month or so.
Awesome, lovely. Thanks a lot for having me, and thanks for the beautiful coffee as well.
No problems at all. It's always nice to do things face to face so we can have a nice coffee with our chat. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode of A View from the Top, and look forward to everybody joining us on the next episode of A View from the Top. Take care and have a great day.